Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to Ask Zajef Ayato edition. Woohoo! Let's go! By the way, thank you to one of my mods, Schaufle, for compiling all of these and removing the duplicates so I don't have to go through 300 questions, but rather like 34. Makes my life a lot easier, so thank you very much. Say thank you, Schaufle, in the comments. Do it. First things first, what's his overall place in the meta, pull value, and how much has changed with him, if at all, after Dendro's release? So before Dendro, Ayato was kind of just this whatever hydro character that really could work anywhere, but wasn't really the best anywhere. He works in Taser, he works with Sangling and Vape, he works in Freeze, and although you could make an argument for him being like the optimal unit for Taser, Taser often doesn't run a healer, so most people would still prefer Kokomi. What's happened with Dendro is he's also now an option for Hyper Bloom and Burgeon. Ayato is very much a jack of all trades. The thing though is that that's still valuable in Genshin because, well, some people will save up enough to go for a character that's very, very good at a specific thing for each of the things they care about. Some people will save for Childe, for International, for Kokomi and Freeze and whatnot, right? But some people want to pull for one Hydro unit and then be done with it and be able to just go for whatever units they prefer from there on out. And that makes it so that Ayato has a lot of value in those situations. That being said, I think that the main thing that Ayato has going for him is just how brain dead to play he is. Basically, all of the other Hydro units, you kind of just gotta do some rotations and shit like that. And like, maybe your single target, so, or your AoE isn't that big. The thing about Ayato is, Ayato's AoE is just so big on his normal attacks. Like, the size of this shit is actually kind of massive. And because it's so big, it makes it so that even if you don't group the enemies perfectly, very often you'll still be hitting all of them. Which kind of makes it so that Ayato's a lot more forgiving of you fucking up your enemy grouping. And because that's an important part of the game, just getting your enemy grouping, then that's very significant. I don't think Ayato is ever like the best option, although there will be teams, mainly I would say some Hyper Bloom teams, where when you're in AoE situations, you're looking for good AoE Hydro application, and he would be a better option than basically any of the other Hydros, just because his application is just better than the alternatives, because Childe would have faster application, but then downtime, whereas Ayato's burst still keeps applying Hydro even when he's not on field, so that gives him a little bit of off-field value. And when it comes to Hyper Bloom, applying Hydro 83 times in 2 seconds doesn't do that much, whereas applying Hydro consistently over 20 seconds does. So basically, he now has some Dendro teams where he is, when it comes to AoE situations, the best option, but he's mostly still very much just a jack of all trades character that you get because you only really want to get one Hydro unit and then you want to go for other units. How much does his pull value diminish if an account already has one of the other limited 5-star Hydros? It depends, right? It basically just depends on what teams you want to play. Personally, Ayato is one of the units that I'm most glad I pulled because I actually do end up using him very often. He's just a very good way to like get a second team going. I really like this team that I'll probably be talking about a little bit later, and also with this. The main thing is like, you never need Ayato, basically. Like, you never need Ayato in the sense that like, you need Ayato but no other Hydro would work. It's just, he's always fine. I wouldn't call him mid, because like, he's always like above average, but he's never like insane. Ayato or Childe, and do you think he's more comparable to Kokomi or Childe? I mean, it depends again, right? Childe is very, very good in International, and that's kind of his only team. Ayato is quite good in basically any archetype. It depends on what you want. Do you think he's more comparable to Kokomi or Childe? Probably more comparable to Kokomi, actually. Think of him as like a Kokomi where you trade some healing for better AoE and a bit more damage. How big is the Childe Ayato gap in National? So the thing about National teams and International teams with Childe is that with Childe specifically, you kind of just don't have bad matchups, and your rotations are very adaptable, and it scales really well with hyper investment in a way it doesn't work as well with Ayato. The biggest problem with Ayato in national teams is that he doesn't really work with Kazuha. So the thing about Ayato is you don't actually have good double swirl setups with Kazuha unless you start relying on RNG, because because in order to get your double swirl setups, you have to use your burst, and it kind of relies on RNG so that your burst is hits at the right time. And it's kind of just bruh. When it comes to Sucrose, you're not reliant on RNG because you can basically do slightly different setups and use a Guava Swirl. So he still works, he's still consistent in National with Sucrose, but he's not with Kazuha, which obviously gives him less versatility. Right, because Childe also works with Sucrose, but he also works with Kazuha, whereas Ayato doesn't, right? I'd say it's a pretty decent gap, but if you're using Sucrose, like your Ayato, Sangling, Bennett, Sucrose team will still clear shit without a problem. Generally speaking, how good is his personal damage, and is his off-field burst only viable compared to his usual on-field build? Okay, his personal damage is like pretty average overall. His DPS is good while he's on field, and then he has downtime, and his uptime is kind of not ideal for most teams. The fact that you got 6 seconds on and then 6 seconds off, which makes it so that overall his damage in most teams end up being somewhat but it's not bad. And his burst builds, it's like, you want to get enough ER to burst every rotation most of the time, but in some teams it requires too much ER and you just say fuck it and burst every other rotation. His personal damage isn't that of a hyper carry because he's not a hyper carry, and if you try to play him as a hyper carry, he's not a good hyper carry. You can force him into it, but it won't be very good. But for an on-field enabler, it's pretty good. Anyways, burst builds can be fine in a bunch of Dendro teams, and I like them a lot, but generally it's mostly just focused on getting your burst, but focusing on your normal attacks. Thoughts on his burst, considering how people mainly tend to gloss over it when looking at his kit? His burst is unironically really, really strong. The main thing that his burst does is it gives you good Hydro App for a bunch of setups and for a bunch of teams, right? So if you look at, well, channeling teams, because of his burst, you don't really lose any vapes from your Powernado. But if you start looking at the Dendro teams, his burst effectively almost doubles the amount of blooms you're generating, and therefore the amount of hyper blooms that you're proccing. The damage it does is like, okay, it's nothing crazy, but it's not useless either. But it's mostly just the way that it applies Hydro is pretty useful for him. Artifact sets and stats overview. Briefly discuss Echo's ping woes, his best sets for both on and off field, HP versus attack versus ER Sands, and his Shimenawa Ayato a thing. Okay, let's start with HP Sands. No. Glad we got that out of the way. Echoes, bro, Echoes is just so dies of cringe. So, when normal attacks hit opponent, there's a chance that it'll trigger Valley Right, which will increase the damage. The effect will be dispelled. Very cool. The odds of it triggering the next time will increase by 20%. This trigger can occur once every 0.2 seconds. The thing is, this registers on server side, which means that if you have high ping, you basically get some hits that just don't proc this. Like, that don't have a chance to proc this. So you're just like, oh, okay, so instead of getting it the average amount of times, I'm getting it like 50% less because I got high ping. The thing is, I don't actually know what the ping breakpoints are for this because I never really looked into it too much, because honestly, once I learned that and seeing how Echoes is just not really ever significantly above the other options that you have, I just figured, you know what, fuck Echoes, just don't bother. Which is my thoughts still to this day. I think like Echoes just isn't worth it because Glad is so good on him. You just get so much Glad just from existing, and Glad is not much worse than Echoes, especially because it's with Vermilion, which is a set that basically no one uses either. So in general, like, you can use it if you have a good Echoes, like you didn't farm it for no reason, like it's still fine. But generally, Glad or Heart of Depth are what I would stick to. Do not, and I repeat, do not use Shimenawas. Please don't do that to yourself, man. Stop! Stop trying to use Shimenawas on units with good bursts! It's fine. Don't use it. Honorable mentions go to Emblem of Severed Fates and Thundering Fury. If you end up using Ayato in a team where he doesn't really spend time on field, which you can in a bunch of the Dendro teams just because the Hydro App is that valuable, and having decent off-field AoE Hydro App is pretty rare, so Ayato's like actually a good option for that, then you're gonna need a lot of ER, and at that point, your best set is generally just gonna be Emblem of Severed Fates. And then, in some other Dendro teams and Taser teams, you can do the Zajef Special. So for those of you who don't know, the Zajef Special is putting Thundering Fury on a non-Electro unit. When it comes to Taser teams, it makes your rotation shorter, but it doesn't really like increase your team's DPS by a very significant amount, so it's kind of just whatever. However, when it comes to Dendro teams, unironically, relatively often, it is his best set. Basically lets you get 2 E's in a row instead of having to wait, which in a lot of the Dendro teams actually matters a whole lot, because that's when you're getting your Dendro application. And your electro application in all your shit. Actually, one thing that you might want to know about Ayato is you can't swap out of him after you use your burst immediately. You have to wait like half a second for some reason.
Kamisato, Swirls.
It's fine.
Eyes on me.
Be still.
Right, and as you can see, we basically get permanent E uptime. Now, if the enemies had not died, then they would still have Nahida's E on them, right? So you would have been able to keep going, and you basically effectively get 12 seconds of uptime and 12 seconds of hydro application instead of just 6. Which is very, very significant in Hyper Bloom teams, where your damage is basically decided by how fast you're applying hydro. All of this to say, in teams like this, Thundering Fury is unironically his best option. And as a Thundering Fury enthusiast, that makes me happy. And then attack versus ER sense, basically always attack. If you need ER sense to get your burst every rotation, generally it's kind of just better off to just get it every other rotation. But like, ugh, yeah. Unless you're going off-field Ayato. Are split sets any good on him or only for interim builds? They're fine, but generally, because he works so well with Glad, just go 2-piece Glad, 2-piece Glad, aka 4-piece Glad. You have good Glad pieces, just use them. We briefly discussed 4-piece TF Ayato. Oh, well, I got ahead of that one, didn't I? It can also be fine in Taser, but in Taser, it's not something that like, yeah, that's what you want to do. It's just an option that you have. In Double Electro Hyper Bloom, it is what you want to do. So when you're playing with Beto, if you're only playing Raiden or Cookie, you kind of just don't have enough electro application for Ayato to be getting a decent amount of electro charges, which is how he procs the TF set. So generally, right, if you're going double Hydro, you don't put him on TF. It's generally only if you're going double Electro. Is HP% a good substat for him? Meh. HP% is like flat attack, basically. It's not what you want, but it's better than defense, I guess. Is EM a valuable substat on him, or is it relatively low value? I mean, it depends on the team. On Taser, you can also consider it like flat attack. With Nilo, it's very good. And if you're trying to play him as a hyper, it's just basically useless. How much ER does Ayato generally want, as well as for those who intend to burst every rotation? Okay, the thing about Ayato is it's so hard to tell how much ER he wants, because not only does he need different amounts of ER for all of his different teams, and well, he works in so many different teams that that's already a lot, but then on top of that, depending on your rotation, you're gonna get a different amount of energy from his Ascension 4 passive that gives him 2 energy per second when he's not on field, and his energy is less than 40. So his ER requirement range is gonna be anywhere between like none and like 300. I generally like getting 130 to 140 as like a comfortable sweet spot for most teams, but like I can't tell you how much ER if I don't know which team you're playing, basically. And even then, I'd also need to know how you're playing it. Weapon overview, which weapons are good to use on him, good free-to-play options, and is Haran a good weapon to go for in general? Because Ayato is very often more of an enabler than a hyper carry, that means he doesn't often stack a lot of buffs. If you want to make him stack a lot of buffs, you can, but generally you'll end up with worse teams than if you're playing Ayato in a Dendro team or something like that. What that means is that a lot of the time, because you don't have a lot of buffs, you don't have a lot of attack buffs, you don't have a lot of damage percent buffs, it makes the 5-star weapons separate themselves from the 4-star weapons a bit more. So here, right, in the KQM Ayato guide, they have 125% of Black Sword R1, which is about 130% of the free-to-play option, the Ishin Blade, and that's with Bennett. Now, the calcs I did were without Bennett, and it's closer to 134. The thing about that, though, is that, again, in my situation, in my case, if you're not using him with a lot of buffs, it also means that the actual number that he's doing, right, the actual amount of damage that he's doing, isn't the main source of damage on your team. It's a significant part of it, but it's not 70% of your team's DPS. And because of that, then going for a 5-star weapon on him specifically doesn't increase your team's DPS by a significant amount, even if the percentage difference can make it seem like it does. Haran is a very good weapon on him, but I definitely don't think that you should be pulling 5-star weapons for your Ayato if you're planning on going for him in a team like the Hyper Bloom teams. If you want to whale for him, you can get him to like the kind of output that hyper carries need to be good hyper carries, and then at that point, then going for a bunch of buffs on your team, going Bennett, Kazuha, I don't know, Yunzen, it's going to be very strong if you whale on an Ayato and shit, and then at that point, the value of the 5-star weapons is better. But overall, I would say that Ayato is one of those characters that their personal damage is good, but it's not good enough to really justify going for a 5-star weapon on them. That out of the way, if you're looking for weapons on him, his base free-to-play option is the Kagotsurube Ishin, the Kazuha Quest weapon. He kind of just doesn't have a weapon, like a free-to-play option weapon that actually works well with him. So you're kind of just stuck with whatever's the least shit, which is going to be the Kagotsurube Ishin. If you're able to just never get hit, or if you're playing with a shielder, you can also use the Harbinger of Dawn, which can perform better, but is conditional. And then if you have a black sword, that is also pretty good. And Lion's Roar is also pretty good. Aminoma is not very good unless you need the energy. And when you need the energy, generally you just want to go 5. Does Ayato's weapon affect which artifact set he favors more? Yes. The more attack buffs you get, the more Heart of Depth gains in value. And so the more attack your weapon has, right? If it's Summit Shaper, for example, the more Heart of Depth gains in value because it doesn't give any attack. It just gives stats that get multiplied with attack, right? It just gives damage percent. Whereas the more damage percent you have, the more you start favoring Gladiator versus Harbinger, but even more, you would start favoring Echoes if your ping is under about 100, I think. And if you have a lot, like a massive amount of damage percent, then Echoes just starts being a pretty good option. Which is why when you have Haran, right, his signature weapon that gives 52% damage percent to his normal attack, because it's 40 to normal attacks and then 12 elemental damage, then that's kind of just like, bro, okay, yeah, maybe Echoes might be worth farming at that point, if your ping allows for it. Constellation Overview, do any of his constellations stand out as particularly good, especially over his best in slot? And does his C2 affect his weapon ranking and or Sans main stats? Okay. C1, 40% increased damage against enemies with 50% HP or less, but generally that's actually a little bit less than 50% of the time, but still about a 20% damage percent, which is like between 5 and 10 actual increase, like percent increase in damage, which is not very good. C2 is a little bit better overall. It gives you a little bit more, if I remember correctly, but it's still not great. C1 and C2 together is less good than his signature. So if you're a Dolphin or you just really like Ayato, whatever, you want to go for something for him, his signature would be better than his constellations. His C3 is his talent constellation. It's his second best constellation after C6. His C4, also pretty okay. His C5 is pretty bad. And then his C6 is pretty okay. It gives you some nuke potential, but other than that, it's kind of meh. And does his C2 affect his weapon ranking and or Sans main stat? Not really. Like, it will slightly favor damage percent weapons. It will not really change his main stat priorities. And main HP percent are a little tiny bit better, but not significantly, so it's like, eh. Team overview. Which teams does he work best in? Which archetypes can he generally slot into? And does he work well for Hyperbloom teams? So we've already talked about this a little bit, but I guess we can go into it a little bit more. I mostly use Ayato in Hyperbloom teams. So I use him either in double Hydro Hyperbloom. I'll be using Nahida and DMC interchangeably. Like, they both work. It doesn't really matter which one you go for. I've also been liking double Electro, so with Beto instead, which lets you go TF on Ayato. You can do double Dendro, but I'm not a huge fan. Other than that, I've played him a bit in some Burgeon teams where you don't really spend too much time on him and you put him on Fav and basically just use him because he's giving you AoE Hydro App off field. Again, right, this Abyss, not good to show that, but it does well in AoE. Mostly that kind of stuff is what I've been liking. You can use him in Nilo Bloom. I haven't done it because I don't have Nilo on this account and I don't have Ayato in my free-to-play. But you can use him with Nilo Bloom as a third Hydro if you're going Nilo, Nahida, Kokomi. And when it comes to AoE, he's actually just a good option to have there. I mean, you can also use him in some Burgeon stuff. This, for example, where he performs somewhat well. And yeah, other than that is his pre-Dendro team, so you've got some, like, Taser, but obviously it's a little bit harder to fit a healer in these Taser teams, which is why a lot of people prefer Kokomi. You can play him in National. You can play him in basically any freeze team, and he does fine in the freeze teams, but he's not, like, great, but he's also not bad. You're getting freeze, which is just a broken reaction, so when freeze is good, you can play it with Ayato. He's very, very versatile in his teams. You can also play him in the hyper teams, although I know that, like, the team that people like to show big numbers is this. I don't like this team at all. I think it's grief as shit, because you actually need to get a decent amount of ER on Ayato if you want to burst every rotation in a team like this. And also, Yunjin is basically a single target unit because in AoE, you use up all your stacks and then you don't have any more. I have preferred just using Singto instead, because you still get some single target damage and arguably better. And then on top of that, he basically batteries your Ayato so you don't have to build any ER on him. And he gives you the damage reduction that is just so understated. It's so broken. And you can also use use Yelan. Oh, you can also use him in soup. Sorry, I forgot about soup. Ayato, Bennett, Fischl, Kazuha or something like this. This also works pretty well. Because of Ayato's AoE, and as a versatile unit to begin with, he's also a very good unit to be like one of your sources of damage in Venti chambers. Not only because he can hit enemies in Venti's burst, but also because his burst has a pseudo-quadratic scaling that gets improved a lot by Venti's burst. So that does it for the Ask Zajef. I hope you had a nice time. As usual, you can check me out on Twitch at twitch.tv/Zajef77. Don't forget to like and subscribe and do all of the things. If you haven't left a comment at the beginning of the video when I told you to, thank Schaufle right now. Do it, okay? Do it. Do it. Do it. I'll see you guys around. Bye, YouTube. Be still. Mind the deluge. Cascade. The depths beckon. Kamisato art. Suyu. Soryu suye. Sanjaku no shusui. Kenye yo. Yasuraka ni. Kamisato ryu. Suyu. Ah.